If you're watching this video, it's likely you've experienced some kind of plateau in your climbing at some point where you went a long time without climbing a new grade. But I think the good news here is that grades are a bad way of measuring progress, and I think that's the wrong approach here. There's a law in economics made by Charles Goodhart called Goodhart's Law, which basically states when a measure becomes the target, it ceases to be a good measure. So this applies to economics. For example, if your goal was to increase living standards and your measure of that was the country's GDP, if you then tried to just raise the country's GDP, it would cease to be a good measure because it's not the most effective way of raising living standards because of things like income inequality and etc. And as I said, this law applies to so many disciplines, including climbing. So for example, hangboarding, some people get obsessed with their hangboarding numbers and they kind of lose scope of their larger climbing strength, or they might get a false sense of progress when they just see their weight on the hangboard go up. I say all this to say that climbing harder grades, which is another measure of how hard you can climb, should not necessarily always be your priority, and it is not always the most efficient way to get better at climbing. The first reason I think grades are a bad measure and a bad thing to obsess over is because of this concept of a pyramid versus a skyscraper. When you only ever try to climb at your limit and try and push for the next and next hardest grade all the time, your graph, let's say, of climbs becomes a skyscraper where you have no real foundation layer of easier level climbs. I think we want more of a pyramid where for every max level climb you've done a couple more at the grade just below it. You might have seen takes like this online.
Just V7, move on. V6 is now below you. You are so much stronger now. V7.
I'm not trying to insult this guy. I'm sure he's a lovely guy, but I disagree. Second reason always pushing for harder and harder grades is bad is because you need training time and performance time. And I think a good way of looking at this is like bodybuilding, where bodybuilders have phases where they bulk up and they gain lots of muscle and strength. And then they have phases where they cut down and they have their body actually look good, but their strength diminishes. I think when you're always trying to perform at your highest level as a climber, it's the same as if a bodybuilder was always trying to look their best, rather than having phases where they focus on strength and building the actual muscle. I think the final reason is because of subjectivity of grades and also different styles. And what I mean by this is, if you're trying to send a route which says V8, that might not necessarily be the right intensity level for you. Even though it says V8, it could really suit your style, or it could be soft. Instead of basing what we climb on the grade, I think it's far more important to base what's hard for you and what style you want to work. For example, for me, I'm really bad at compression style boulders and I'm much better at crimpy face climbing. So it might serve me better to do a compression climb, even if it's a lower grade. So what I think we should do instead is take all of these metrics and look at them all, instead of isolating a single one like grades or hangboard strength. Goodhart himself said measures should add to a wider context. And again, this applies to climbing, where we have hangboard strength, flexibility, endurance, how clean your technique feels, and how much climbing you can handle in a week. There's so much. The metric I like most is how easy a climb you've tried or a climb you've done before feels when revisiting it after a certain period of time. But again, this is one metric of many. My final point is that all of these metrics that I just listed off are useful because they might be constraints to your progress. So for example, if your hangboard numbers are low compared to how hard you can climb on crimps, that might be a sign that you should go away and try and improve your finger strength. And I think that sort of analysis is far more useful than just obsessing over what grade you're climbing. This is a picture here of some of the metrics I use to gauge what level I'm at. And the two highlighted ones are what I feel are the two constraints in my climbing. So I'm setting a lot of bad footholds on board climbs, and also trying to do lots of moves with like deep shouldery lock-offs. This is also why I wrote plateau in the title, is because I don't really believe in plateaus if you're always progressing in some way or another in any of these metrics. If you're making progress in a constraint to your climbing ability, then you are getting better and you will eventually break into the next set of grades.